my interest, I mean, as Nick and Ingrid know, my interest was really in the role of the Arabic language, and specifically trying to tether the role of a language to a field is something that's common perhaps in other professions, in other industries, in other practices. Within architecture, I found those two conversations to be a little bit more distant. As I explored, of course, the French and English and perhaps the Spanish language were more prominent. But as I explored the topic of the Arabic language, for instance, what I found was there was a discrepancy. And as I was educated within the field of architecture and urbanism, I found that even to be more distant. So this began a major inquiry in the research that I've been fascinated with. I started to examine the topic of language and architecture, broadly speaking. What is the relationship between these two topics? And specifically how architecture has been formalized professionally as something that's certified and recognized within the professional environment. The second is I explored the topic of architectural education, specifically within the framework of an Arab-speaking world. So not necessarily tethered to Arabism or Pan-Arabism, and I'll talk briefly about this, but really looking at language as a device, as a tool, as a medium that communicates the subject matter. The third, I was also interested in publications, publishers and authorities that produce publications around this topic. And then finally, I'd like to talk about two topics, which is films and documentaries, and finally the relationship of how architecture as a degree is recognized. So when you come to explore the topic of architecture in the Arab world, you can almost begin in the 1930s and 40s, where architecture as a term began to be formalized and began to be recognized as a profession. Whereas historically it was always either the engineer or the artisan or the craftsman, but it wasn't really necessarily the architect. But that also was contested as a topic. I mean, architect can mean designer, can play a part in engineering, can play a part in construction, in structure, and so forth. Within the Arabic language, the term architect is defined as mi'mar. And historically, it was always tethered as al-muhandis al-mi'mari, which is specifically engineer-architect. So this really begins the complex relationship of the field of architecture and language. So from there, I begin to try to define what architecture or what an architect is. And when you use the term mi'mari, which currently defines the word architect, it has other connotations, which is living, storage, constructor, and so forth. So this also, from a Pan-Arabism point of view, or an Arabic-speaking region, also has its different definitions. So from there, I start to question how this is put to the test. And naturally, when you start to look at that, you start to explore where this topic starts to be canonized, right? So if we're trying to pigeonhole a word such as architect, right, within the Arabic language, we're kind of either translating this term and trying to force it to act as a discipline, and we're trying to create all of these technical professionals or technocrats within the field. We start to also begin to open up some dialogues, and I refer to Edward Said's publication Out of Place, and I'll just read two quick excerpts where he says that for scholars and teachers of my generation who were educated in what was essentially a Eurocentric mode, the landscape and topography of literary studies have therefore been altered dramatically and irreversibly. Literary studies now operates with different aims and goals, all inhibited a mental and aesthetic universe. Scholars of the new generation are much more attuned to the non-European, genderized, decolonized, and decentered energies and currents of our time. So here, when you read terms such as this or this excerpt, you start to question the performance of language, right? So we are all educated and what in a sense is a Eurocentric the language, but in a sense, a language that acts as a device. And here, I think this is where it gets put to the question, or this is where it tends to be placed in question. And of course, naturally, that finds its way in identity, right? So we are architects, professionals that practice either in our geography, in our city, in our country, but also internationally. And so we start to look at identity, and Zaha Hadid is a character that we're all familiar with, the late Zaha Hadid, studied at the AA, but also identifies herself as an Arab woman. When we were younger, and whenever coincidentally we would ever meet her or see her, she would speak in a very thick Iraqi accent and spoke Arabic. And it's very interesting when we see these terms of identities really out. And what I'd like to reiterate that my interest is not with the Arab identity. My interest was with language. I was looking at the role of the Arabic language and the Arab-speaking languages. And here you look, by definition, you look at over 400 million people that speak the Arabic language, and over 20 countries that adopt Arabic as their language, as their primary language. So that was really my interest. And from there were multiple topics that I explored within my thesis, but in this conversation, I'd like to just focus on the role of language through education and knowledge production, beyond the topic of migration, exhibitions, and practice. And from here, I look at three different topics, which are academic institutions across the region. I look at literature, books, magazines, and films. And then finally, briefly, the practice of architecture, not necessarily as design and build, but actually certified and recognized as an architect, and who defines you as an architect. And as we look at architects that are Arabic speaking, we see them continue to write in the Arabic language, whether it's like Hashim Sarkis, Nasser Rabah, who we're familiar with, this Mohammed Makkiya, who lived in London, Rafat Chadirji, who equally lived in London, Mu'ad al-Alusi, who lived in Greece, all authored and wrote in the Arabic language. Although they lived internationally, they practiced internationally, they found that the Arabic language was still central to a lot of their research and their work. So the point of this is just, as I started to investigate the topic of architecture and the Arabic language, what I see is I see scholarship, I see authorship, I see interest remaining within the Arabic language, and with that, the advancement of language within the field of architecture. And as I go along, I start to explore the role of departments within architecture, within the region, sorry. And as I look at different departments, you have different places, some have English, some have French, and so forth. And I took a cross-section, just as examples, to see how that is situated, and I started to examine a few curriculum. And then I kept narrowing it down, as Nick would say. Narrow it down, Rashid. So I continue to do. And finally, what ended up happening is I began to observe a few patterns that became clear in the challenges that we were facing. So a lot of these, so what we've just recently discussed is that the Arabic language historically played a role in the built environment as the discipline of architecture in the early 1930s. Fast forward, became a discipline that was recognized within this field across the region. The Arabic language was being advanced by authors that were interested in the built environment, and as we saw, I started to recognize that architectural education was competing in multiple languages, including French and English. And briefly, there was a movement during that time called Al-Nahba, which is the cultural awakening. And that movement created a momentum for Arab identity in part, which I look at, but I was more interested in the role of Arabic language. And through that, there were two advancing topics, two topics that were advancing. which is a topic called tawleed, which is the ability to take a word and then adopt it as a language within the discipline. So the example we were talking about is mi'mar, for instance, right? So this al-mi'mar, the architect in Arabic, which took a new form of identity within the Arabic language, and with that became a discipline and so forth. So tawleed as an idea was moving forward to build a new lexicon and curriculum within the Arabic language. But equally, the Arabic language is diverse and complex, because across the region you have different dialects and so forth. So another finding emerges called diglossia, which is the ability to speak the Arabic language in its formal usage, which is called fusha, but also the more informal and casual dialects, which were more local and native or specific. So, for instance, in Morocco versus Dubai versus Jordan, the dialects would be different. Not that they would not be understood, but they all encompass their own local culture and so forth. So there were these different tiers of development, which is formal, a formal type of Arabic, which was institutionalized and so forth, but also the casualness of language was also being adopted in this diglossia. But equally, there's something in parallel where people would speak Arabic and French or Arabic and English, and we see that even more in common. So across the board, these were three major findings that we've seen the Arabic language advance within the field of architecture. What was also evident was the fact that although these the role of the Arabic language had the potential to advance and to take center stage within architectural education, the reality of it is a lot of these universities relied on finding ways to certify their education. And in particular, the English language through the RIBA became a mode of their way of certifying their education. So a lot of the English-speaking universities would either rely on the RIBA or would rely on the American equivalent, the AIA, or the French-speaking countries would rely on the Beaux-Arts, as we saw in Gulnar's presentation, that a lot of the education within Iran was certified by the Beaux-Arts. So this was a major finding here, the reason why architectural education across the region, though it had the potential for it to advance within its language, just equally as Japan educates architecture in Japanese or Latin America within Spanish or Portuguese. In the case of the Arab-speaking world, a majority of these universities educate within English or French because of certification and accreditation. And there are multiple reasons that I can go into to justify those reasons of why they chose to be certified by the Beaux-Arts or RIBA. But that is the reality of the situation. So this was a moment of crisis, right? So this revelation became a moment of crisis, and with a lot of the professionals and academics, they came together to try to address this issue. And there was a moment in 1986 in Granada, Spain, where a lot of these architects, educators, and professionals came under a major conference called Architectural Education in the Islamic World, where they tried to deal and address this issue of accreditation. And the most important thing is that through this conference, they recognized the challenges, which are the challenges we were discussing, but also their attempt to rectify and to address these challenges in building new forms of curriculum, in recognizing forms of discourse, and so forth. So this was a moment where the Islamic world in general, and a majority of them were the Arab-speaking world, that came together to address the topic of language. And of course, with those conferences, the gaps within knowledge started to appear. So I'll read something from Jamal, who was an educator in King Saud University in Saudi Arabia. He says the absence of Arabic referential materials for architectural instructions in general and modern architecture in particular has led to the adoption of English as the language of instruction in all schools. This led to the dependence of the English-speaking faculty. As to the quality of education, it is definitely affected by the language problem, which results in poor communication between teachers and students. Although all curricula contains intensive English courses, Saudi society has only recently accepted English as a second language. According to most faculty, the reverse is also true, and faculty may fail in transmitting their thoughts to their students due to the language. So these are the realities of the situation, right? So a lot of trying to advance language, dealing with them, but the lack of academic comprehension material. And finally, just a quote from Rafat Chadirji, who is an architect, a scholar, and educator, who a major force within the Arab world. He again reflects that this has to come from within the region, that we have to reflect our own values through this approach of egalitarian, symbolic, and aesthetic values, and so forth. So this was an important. So that being said, just to slowly conclude within the presentation, a major part of this, of my research was to try to say, can we build a counter-narrative? Can we try to look at a canon or a form of scholarship that can sit in parallel to the discourse of architecture contemporarily or historically? And I'm not advocating for either or, right? I'm not saying, oh, we should start to educate within the Arabic language, or am I saying we should educate in English or French? I'm saying in a world today where our architectural education is questioned or in question or debated fiercely right now, language can play a really important role if you are studying architecture and interested in Japanese movement. Why can't language play a more central role? I mean, if you're interested in the Arab world, and many architects from Europe or America are practicing in the region, why can't architectural education educate in part, electively, passionately, or centrally in the Arabic language, and language becomes something even more of a force that makes you understand the context, understand the culture, be more specific. Why can't we start thinking about the built environment in this way? So anyways, this was just a brief slide to show you that scholarship existed historically, continues to exist, and is not that visible within architectural education across the region. Let alone not only publications, but also film. For instance, the film on the left is The Social Life of Small Urban Spaces, which we are all familiar with, William White's work. But also in the 60s, Ahmed Bou'nani produced a film called Casablanca 611, and he talked about the challenges of gentrification at the same time when Ruth Glass or Jane Jacobs was talking about these types of debates. He was producing a film about the challenges of gentrification in North Africa or Casablanca. And then finally, I'd like to leave you with a note by one of my favorite Arab authors, George Sabasheva, and he said, if Kuwait can build the largest sea-water desalination plant in the world, Saudi Arabia can build the largest air-conditioned power plant in the world, and Lebanon, the most glamorous casinos in the world, the Arab world must and can master the best brains in the world to study the region, the economic futures of the Arab world on a scientific basis. It's a very cool cover as well.